All right, y'all, welcome back, YouTube. Today, I'm going to be taking you through the conventional deadlift and how you can set up better, how you can execute it better, and just how you can be better at the movement as a whole, because you're probably powerlifting, or maybe you just want a stronger deadlift. So I'm going to help you through that and help you maximize what you're doing on the conventional deadlift. Now, when talking about the deadlift or really any movement in general, I think the most important thing that we get down first is our setup and making sure that we have an efficient setup and a setup that's going to put us in the best position to lift the most amount of weight. Oftentimes, people setting up on a lift incorrectly leads them to then executing the lift incorrectly. So if we can nail the setup, we can nail the lift itself. With the conventional deadlift, what matters with our setup? Well, for me, I like to start from the bottom up, and the point of contact with the ground is our feet. And we want to have our feet in the right position. So how wide are we? What angle is our toes? How close we are to the bar? How far away from the bar? These are all things to consider when setting up in the deadlift. So for me, personally, where do I find my foot width first? For me, I find that a good way to find the width that you should be standing on the deadlift is you jump up in the air, and where you land with your feet is roughly where you would want to stand. Now, obviously, if you've been deadlifting for a long time or you've been doing the movement for a while, you're going to find what works for you, and that may be a little bit wider than that or a little bit narrower. And it's going to come down to you experimenting. All right, so now that you've established your stance width, how close should you be to the bar? Now, I find when I'm setting up for the deadlift, I'm going to have the bar roughly over the center of my foot, but this can change depending on how long your shin is, how long your femur is, how your leverages are for the movement. I find a good rule of thumb, when you hinge down to grab the bar, and the bar breaks off the floor, it should just barely be touching your shin. It shouldn't be rolling towards you. It shouldn't be kicked away from you. Just where that bar gently graces upon your shins is about the distance that you want to have between your shins and the bar. So when you're standing up, it shouldn't be touching the bar, but when you hinge down to it, your shins should then touch. So that's where I'm going to determine the stance distance from the bar. And then lastly, your toe angle. Some people may feel a little bit better with their toes pointed slightly out. Some people may feel better with their toes, forward. That also is going to come down to preference. But these are things that you should be paying attention to when you're setting up for the deadlift. If your width or your distance from the bar or your toe angle is changing every set or every rep, you have no consistency and it's going to make your deadlift worse. Now, the next point, now that we've found where we want to put our feet, what are we going to be doing with our feet? And I find that a good foot pressure and a good level of balance is going to lead to better center of mass management and then a more efficient deadlift across the board. So a lot of people are either, back on their heels and their toes are coming up. That's really the most common issue I see. Or sometimes people will be a bit too far over their toes and their heel comes up a little bit and they don't maintain that midfoot. And we really want to be maintaining a midfoot pressure throughout the entirety of the deadlift, because if we lose that midfoot pressure or that ground connection, you'll get tipped forward, you'll get tipped backward, you won't be able to stay in position. So make sure that once you've planted your foot, you're keeping that foot flat and connected to the ground the entire time. Bonus points, you should be deadlifting in a flat shoe. You should not be deadlifting in running shoes. If you want, you can get a good pair of flats or a pair of water shoes or a slipper. Something like that is going to be way better than a thick soled shoe. Moving our way up from the foot, we can talk about our knees and the position of our knees. Now, I find that our knee position and our hip position are related, so I'm going to talk about both right now. The position that your knees will be in and the level of knee flexion you have, as well as the level of hip flexion you have, is going to be dependent on how you're built. People that are a lot taller and a lot, maybe more poorly leveraged for the lift are probably going to have a bit more knee flexion, a bit more hip flexion to get down to the bar. But this can all vary a ton between whether someone's relative shin length is a lot longer compared to their femur or their femur's longer compared to their shin. It's not all about height because those lengths can be different on all types of people. But the point is, you're going to find for you a relative level of knee flexion and hip flexion that sets you up in the best position for the deadlift. So what is that? I find that the most common issue I see people doing when they deadlift is when they wedge into the bar, their hips shoot up and then their knees straighten out a little bit. And the issue that they have is that they're bending their knees too much and they're setting their hips too low. So I think that's a good starting point to address when looking at your deadlift is maybe you're flexing your knee too much. Maybe you're squatting down to the floor instead of hinging down to the floor, and you're having too much knee flexion. So I find for beginners, you should probably have less knee flexion than you're already having, and a little bit more hip flexion. Not squatting down to the bar, but hinging back. So the way I would teach this, I would get a kettlebell, I would bend over as if I'm going to pick it up. I pick the kettlebell up, and then I just lower the kettlebell to the floor. And this teaches someone how to hinge before they get to a barbell. So if you watch me, my hips go back and then my knees start to bend. So hips come back, knees start to bend. And that's how I would set up for a deadlift. I would push my hips back just a little bit, and then I would let my knees flex until I get down to the bar. So the same thing applies when we would be setting up for a deadlift, to find the right level of knee flexion, the right level of hip flexion. So I find my correct foot position. I then hinge my hips back until I get a good stretch on my hamstrings. And then I push my knees just slightly forward until I can reach the bar. And you can see my shins just barely touch, so I know my foot is in the right position. And then when I'm in this position, I have just the right level of knee flexion and just the right level of hip flexion. Hey, quick interruption. If you don't like this video or subscribe, no one will love you, no one will ever like you, and you're gonna have 25 years of bad luck. So I would go ahead and do that right now, or the consequences could be dire. So really the big point is, you don't want your knees to be too bent, you don't want your hips to be way too bent over, and you're gonna find that happy medium of where when the bar breaks off the floor, your hips shouldn't shoot up and your knees shouldn't cave. You should be maintaining a very similar position that you were in before the bar breaks off the floor to then when you start pulling. It should be very seamless. It should be very connected. So making our way up the body, moving on from the knees and hips, let's talk about the torso. Let's talk about the head. How should we be positioning ourselves in order to lift the most amount of weight? And I find that you're going to, ultimately come into a very natural position if you fix where you're looking with your eyes. If you're looking straight down at the floor in front of you, that's going to angle your torso down. You're going to be more bent over, and your back is probably going to be a lot more rounded than it needs to be. So a very easy fix that I give people is just look further in front of you, whether that be 6 feet in front of you on the floor, or that's all the way across the gym at the wall. Find something to look at and have your head be up. Because if your eyes are up, your head is up, then your torso is going to be up. And that's going to fix most of the positioning issues with the upper body. So this pretty much covers the setup. There's maybe some smaller, more nuanced details that I could go into in another video, but this video is meant to be more general. So moving on from the setup, we can go now to the execution of the lift. Now, executing the deadlift, there's a few things that we're going to talk about. It is, how do we set our grip? How are we positioning our arms? How are we pulling the slack? So these little things that I'll break down for you to really nail the execution. But if we master the things we're doing in the setup, this is going to be a lot easier to do. Starting with setting the grip. When we're deadlifting, we don't want to be over gripping the bar. We don't want to be having the bar way too deep on our hand where our wrist looks kind of bent like this. We want our wrist to be straight, because if you're deadlifting 400, 500, 600 pounds, or for you, whatever your max is, you are not going to be able to lift your max with a bent wrist. And I see people over gripping the bar, really trying to get the bar deep in their hands, and it always just ends up rolling out of their hand as they're lifting. So how can we combat this? Set the bar lower in your hand. Don't grip it so deep. Set the bar where it's going to roll to anyways. So set the bar a little bit deeper. Don't over grip it. Now, that's as far as how we grip it. Now, where do we grip it? Some people are going to feel comfortable gripping the bar with maybe one finger on the smooth, maybe 2 fingers on the smooth. Some people are going to feel better with their entire hand on the knurling. This is largely going to come down to how wide you are as an individual. The wider you are, the bigger you are, probably the wider your grip's going to have to be. And the smaller your frame and the smaller you are, the narrower it is. But I think a good rule of thumb is, if you record yourself from a front angle, your arm should be straight down. It shouldn't be out like this. It shouldn't be in front of you. You should have a pretty much straight angle between your shoulder, your elbow, and your hand going straight down. And then from there, small adjustments like slightly wider, slightly narrower to fit you and feel more comfortable, you can worry about. But that's a good starting position. And then lastly, do you want to do hook grip? Do you want to do mixed grip? I think that mixed grip is probably the best way to start. It's really simple. You don't have to think a lot about it. You just set your grip and go, whereas hook grip is going to be a lot more technical and maybe harder to master. So, you can pick what you want. I think mixed grip is going to be more reliable, but I think hook grip, if you really master it, you may be able to get in a slightly better position and have some gains from that. But there's plenty of extremely strong people with mixed grip and with hook grip. So you can learn both and you'll be fine. Now, we've set our grip. What are we gonna do with the rest of our arm? I see a lot of people really flexing their arm or being really tense or really stiff. And as a result, they reduce their range of motion because of how stiff they are. So for me, when I coach the deadlift, I'm telling you, have a loose arm. Let your arm be loose. Let your arm be long. Reach that arm away from you. That way you're able to minimize the range of motion you have to go through, and you're then able to get in a better position. So, something I like to do if I'm really tense is I'll just shake my arms, and that'll allow me to just kind of get them loose. Another thing you can do is imagine that your arm is like a long cable and your hands are just hooks. And you want to get that cable and that cable really far away from you, and then just hook the bar with your hands and go from there. Another thing you can think about is getting a good level of protraction. I think a lot of people actually retract their shoulders a little bit and pin their shoulders back, like so. And as a result, they reduce their range of motion. But if we protract and we reach our arms away from us and we extend, we're able to lengthen our arm and reduce our range of motion. So all some little tips to get your arm longer and get you then into a better position. Moving on from here, let's talk about bracing. When we're bracing in a deadlift, it is going to be different than a squat, because in a squat, we have the weight bearing down on our shoulders and there's a lot of axial loading pressure. And as a result, we have to resist that weight that is on us by bracing really hard into a belt. Whereas with deadlift, we're just picking a weight up and the amount of sheer force on our back isn't there. So as a result, the brace is slightly different. So when I'm coaching someone to brace in a deadlift, I'm actually telling them, don't brace as hard. Brace a little bit more relaxed. Allow yourself to get in a slightly better position instead of flexing down in your core and making yourself be really rigid. Because if you brace very hard in a deadlift, you're going to have a more rigid torso, you're going to be pitched more forward, and your positioning is going to be worse as a result. So for me, I find that a slightly looser belt or a slightly thinner belt is better. Something like a 10 millimeter belt is probably going to allow you to get into a slightly better position because it's not so thick. Whereas a 13 millimeter belt is just going to be a bit thicker, a bit more challenging to get in that more upright position that we want in the deadlift. That's kind of how I would brace as far as how hard I'm bracing. Now, as far as where you're bracing, are you bracing up at the top of the lift or are you bracing at the bottom of the lift? I think that there's pros and cons for each. Personally, I'm biased to bracing up at the top, reaching down to grip the bar and go, because it's quicker. You don't have time to think. I find that when people are bracing at the bottom of the lift, they end up getting in their head and they spend too much time in that bottom position. And as a result, they are more likely to overthink or, like I said, take too long, and that can take away from the deadlift. But a benefit of being in that bottom position is, you're going to be more consistent with your grip because you're taking the time to find the right grip, get in the right position. Whereas if you take a breath up at the top, reach down and grab the bar, you may have some inconsistency with where you're setting your hands. So you have to be really intentional with that. But both styles of bracing and where you're bracing, you're probably going to be fine. But take one, stick with it, and use it for several sessions before you try going back and forth. We've talked about, the setup. We've talked about how we're gripping the bar. We've talked about our arm position. We've talked about our bracing. Let's talk about going through the rep itself and really executing it. These are parts of the execution as you're going to get it. But now that we're pushing, now that the bar is breaking off the floor, what are we doing? I find that when I'm lifting, I'm thinking of a few things. One, I'm thinking about keeping my head position relatively similar. So like I told you before, pick a spot on the floor or pick a spot on the wall, and you want to be looking at that spot the entire time. If your eyes are moving around and your head's darting around, you're not going to be able to apply as much force into the floor, and you're then not going to be able to lift as much. The other thing I'm thinking about pushing my feet down into the floor as hard as possible. I find a lot of people over exaggerate the pull, this pulling aspect of the deadlift, because the deadlift is a pulling movement, but I think people pull too hard, and as a result, they don't use their legs as much. So the deadlift is just as much a push into the floor as it is a pull up on the bar. So it's a mix of both. pushing and pulling, but I'm really thinking about pushing pushing myself into the floor, pushing down really hard, and that really helps with positioning. Another thing I'm thinking about is getting my upper back as high as possible or as far away from the floor as possible. Because if you're bent over, if you're too crouched, if you're too slouched, you're going to be creating a greater range of motion with your arm. You're going to be creating just a less advantageous position to be in. So for me, I'm thinking of pushing into the floor and getting my upper back as far away from the floor. That way I can really lengthen the arm, lengthen everything, and minimize my range of motion. Another aspect of execution for the lift is our slack pull. And how are we going to be pulling the slack? Now, an analogy that I love using is the tow strap analogy. If you've ever towed a vehicle or had a vehicle towed, you're going to hook a tow strap up to the front bumper or somewhere underneath the undercarriage of the car, and then you're going to hook it to the back of a truck, and you're going to pull that car with the truck. But no truck that has a tow strap hooked to a car is just going to floor it and take off. You're going to rip that car's bumper off. You're going to ruin the car. You're going to slowly drive away until there's enough slack in that tow strap, and then you're going to start driving and carrying the car. This is the same for your slack pull in a deadlift. You want to pull all that slack out of the bar in the same way you are with that toe strap. And once that slack is completely pulled out by you pulling up with it with your arms, you can then worry about pushing to the floor and, initiating the pull. But way too often, I see people just yank the bar. They don't have any tension in their legs, no tension in their arms, no tension in their upper body. The slack is not pulled, and they get pitched forward or they lose position, and their rep just looks really ugly. So for your slack pull, make sure all that tension is pulled out of the bar before you start pushing into the floor, before you start actually initiating the rep. Make sure it's all pulled out. All right, so those are some cues that I really like. Now let's talk about finishing the rep as far as your execution goes. So a lot of issues I see people doing is they will lock out their lift with soft knees, or their shoulders are slouched forward, and they're not actually locked out in the way that it would be defined in a competition. And if you're powerlifting and want to compete in powerlifting, you need to follow these rules. So when you have finished the rep, your knee should be completely locked out. It should be straight. Your shoulders should be back. You shouldn't be slouched forward. And you should be maintaining control at the top of the rep. If you're able to do those things, implement all these cues, your deadlift will be, quite technically sound. This video is covering like 90% of the bases. There's a few, like I said, other small intricate tweaks we could talk about, but that's for another video. So really some final thoughts for the deadlift. That way you can really get the most out of this. Make sure you are consistent. I laid out all these things. You don't have to think about every single one of them. Some of these things are going to come naturally. Some of these things you're already going to be good at, and you don't have to go up to the deadlift bar and think, okay, I'm doing this, 10 different things in your head. You don't want to overthink. But there may be some little things that you need to address and work on to make your deadlift more efficient. So in watching this video, pick one of them. Like I said, start with the setup. Make sure your setup is consistent from rep to rep. Make sure every time you walk up to the bar, you're doing the same exact thing. That you do and that works for you. That way you have that consistency. And then from there, you can just work on one thing after another. So if your slack pull needs to be better, that's something you can focus on. If your head position needs to be better, you can focus on that. If your hip position, there's many little things, but don't watch this video and think, okay, I need to fix 8 things at once. It's not gonna work. Pick one, get good at it, and work from there, so on and so forth. So I hope this helps. This is my, fairly comprehensive breakdown of the conventional deadlift. Let me know if you have any questions about any type of specifics in the comments. I'd love to go back and forth with you, maybe message you, help you out. I love powerlifting. I love doing these movements. I love coaching people through this. Rich Performance Systems, that's my team. I love it. So if you need any help, message me, follow me on Instagram. But yeah, I hope this all helped, and I hope y'all have a good time conventional deadlifting.